Joining us now to discuss the State of the Union is the host of Facing South Florida, Jim DeFede. So, Jim, a lot of poignant moments tonight. He spoke about the remarkable Americans who kind of made the U.S. An amazing place to be, who are the best of the U.S. What do you think about all those anecdotes?
Yeah, I think it's important, before we get into the nitty-gritty of the speech, to sort of take a step back and acknowledge that this is a great moment in this country. Every year, the State of the Union address is one where we get to sort of see tales and anecdotes of the very best of America. We certainly heard that with that 12-year-old young man, Preston Sharp, who helped raise and make sure there were 40,000 flags on the graves of soldiers that had been unadorned for Veterans Day. And just this different array of stories that you hear. It's a good reminder that there is far more of this country that unites us and we find commonality with than actually divides us.
Now, Jim, he really hammered home the point of immigration and laid out his immigration agenda almost to the expense of touting the economy. I was expecting to hear more about the economy and how well it's doing. Were you surprised?
That's a great point. Absolutely. If you go through the speech, you actually realize that there was about a 500-word section on the economy and well more than 1,000 on immigration. This was an immigration speech. This was very much more an immigration speech than an economic speech, even though I think most Republicans would rather have him talking about the positive nature of the state of the economy right now. But let's talk about that immigration speech, because there was something about it that I just kept trying to understand it. There was so much talk going into the speech about how there was going to be bipartisanship, that this was going to be an open hand that he was going to offer. Yet there were missed opportunities here. I want to just look at one section of the speech and just give you for instance. He's talking about how the country was built 250 years ago on the dream of being able to be a land of freedom. And then one of the things he talks about is, and I'm just going to read it here, the people dreamed this country, the people built this country, and it is the people who are making America great again. Wouldn't it have been amazing if the president had just taken a step back and acknowledged that the people who came to this country, who dreamt of America, who envisioned the freedom of this country, came here from other countries? Just a little bit of a nod. He never acknowledged the dreamers sitting in the audience. He didn't acknowledge a lot of the pain and struggle. Again, he went back to the MS-13 killing people. That was a poignant moment, but again, it needs to be reminded time and time again that the immigrant population in the United States commit crimes at a far, far lower rate than native-born Americans. Yeah,
and there were definitely a few jabs in there throughout the speech. Okay, so what about the idea of unifying all Americans during his first State of the Union speech? Did he succeed overall in bringing people together?
I was surprised. I thought there was going to be more of that. Let me take another instance. Like, there was a moment in the speech where he talked about prescription drugs and how he wants to bring down and make that a major priority. I know that there are Democrats across the aisle that want to do that as well. Bernie Sanders and he actually during the campaign have very similar proposals. Imagine what an electrifying moment it would have been if he had from the podium there reached across and said, and pointed to Bernie Sanders and said, Bernie, this is something you and I can work on. Let's get it done. Instead, again, there were jabs. You know, there were moments when, again, he's opening the open hand and saying, I want to work with Democrats, but the next minute taking jabs at them. And I just found it to be a very inconsistent speech in that regard.
He made some news by saying that he wants to keep Guantanamo Bay open, and we were expecting a lot on infrastructure, but really didn't hear.
There was a section on infrastructure. A year ago, he talked about spending $1 trillion on infrastructure. Today, he said he wants to spend $1.5 trillion on infrastructure. Of course, the problem always becomes how do you pay for that? And the initial proposals that are coming out, the details are that they want the states and the cities to pay a far higher percentage of the cost in revenue sharing that cities and counties just can't afford. So again, that's something that's going to have to be worked out.
Yeah, they don't want to hear that. All right, Jim, thank you so much for your analysis. Jim DeFede.